Do you remember at the beginning of this year when I said I was starting a 100 tiny painting project? Well, we are halfway through 50 tiny paintings, and even though the full tutorials for these are all over on Patreon, I thought it would be fun to do a bonus tiny painting tutorial for you here on YouTube so you can get a taste of what the last 50 paintings have looked like and what the next 50 paintings to finish out for the rest of the year will be like. Before we get into that tutorial, I want to review our tiny paintings real quick. I have them in this amazing photo album that has these 3x3 inch slots like it was made for our tiny paintings. And like I said before, each one of these tiny paintings has a full 10 to 20 minute tutorial over on my Patreon channel. And I really tried to be thoughtful throughout this year of paintings, thinking about what topics we should cover, but also what techniques in watercolor we should address so that our skills are building. So we're talking about water control, wet into wet, dry brush technique, shadows, color mixing like crazy, using masking fluid, wet on dry, etc., etc. So every little painting will teach you something new and hopefully builds upon the skills that we want to learn while also just having the best time. And there is something about painting tiny in a 3x3 square that is so much more less intimidating. And if you make a mistake, quote unquote, you can just do it again. And mistakes really are just learning opportunities, and we're having fun and we're learning and we're growing. And we have painted at least 50 tiny paintings. So here's a preview of our 50 tiny paintings. That was number 50. And we also have actually pushed past that because now we're in September. So we hit 50 in the summer, and I'm finally coming around to making this video. So we do have quite a few more, but I wanted to do a halfway through recap, and I thought it would be fun to share with you a bonus tutorial so that we could paint a tiny painting together. Alright, so let's go over the materials you'll need. I'm using a 3x3 inch piece of watercolor paper. I took a piece of 9x12 Arches paper from this watercolor pad and I cut it into 12 pieces. So if I cut each piece into 3x3 squares, I end up with 12 pieces per piece of paper. So my paper stretches and goes pretty far. And then I also make sure to tape down each piece because we do use a lot of water and this keeps our paper from warping. And when we're using a piece of paper this tiny, it's really hard if it moves around and warps. It's very hard to paint. So we want it to be very stable. You can either tape it to your desk or a piece of cardboard or anything that maybe you could move around your house or tilt if you want your watercolor to kind of drip down the paper for different techniques. So we're going to make sure that is nice and stable. I try to get it as evenly as possible around the edges because that tape peel at the end is so satisfying. This is actually masking tape from the Scotch brand, and it is called Home and Office. And with the higher quality watercolor paper that I use, I do not get any ripping with this tape. If you do have issues with ripping using masking tape, I would suggest using washi tape or maybe even heating your tape up with a heat tool before you remove it. I am using a limited palette of colors. This specific palette is from Sparrow. It has cad yellow, cad red, ultramarine blue. Those are my warm primary colors. And then lemon yellow, magenta, and cyan. Those are my cool primary colors with an added indigo and deeper green for a few bonus colors. So for this tiny painting, I'm taking inspiration from a picture I took in France. We stayed in the French countryside and there were potted geraniums all over this property that were absolutely beautiful. So I'll attach the picture in the corner below. But what we're going for in general is a weathered terracotta pot with tiny red geranium flowers. So the first thing I've done for this painting is sketched out my pot. It's toward the bottom half of the paper, and I want the pot to help give me a guide for where the foliage is going to be. So I'm actually going to be painting the greenery and the flowers first, because then we can tuck the pot color underneath. It's going to be a lot harder to layer the geraniums over the top of the pot color and for them to stand out. So I'm first starting with the green foliage to create the shape and the fullness of the plant that I'm seeing in my reference photo. I'm going to leave a few gaps where I see in my reference photo that there are red flowers, and that's where I'm going to put the red flowers kind of peeking in and around the greenery in the plant. I'm using a size 4 round brush and a mixture of cad yellow and ultramarine blue to create these leaves. Once I place the color down for these leaves, you can see I can use the other end of my brush to drag some of the paint out and create these very fine, thin stems that I'm seeing in my reference. So one of the ways also that I can create dimension within the leaves is to have some areas more concentrated with pigment and some areas are a little bit more watery. And then I can go in with a deeper blue into my green mixture and tap that into my greens in a few areas while it's still wet to create shadow and dimension within my plant. So the goal is to have light areas, warm areas, shadowy areas, and we can do a lot of that while it's still wet. So instead of creating the entire plant and all of the greenery in one go, it's easier to place some of your greenery and see where you've left the gaps, and then add a few flowers and then continue moving throughout the painting, adding greenery and then adding flowers. These geraniums in particular are really tiny, almost like little butterflies, and so I'm doing 2 very tiny petals at the top, 2 very tiny petals at the bottom at a connection point, but really because this is kind of loose and very tiny of a painting already, it doesn't have to be exact. We're just going for the feeling of the reference, and the reference is showing these textured tiny flowers, and so we can really just tap with the shape of our brush these tiny flower shapes. Once I'm happy with how that feels, I can move on to some of the foliage that's coming around the top. So we've determined this falling over part of our painting that's very interacting with the pot, and now we need to determine the height of the painting and how the leaves are coming across. I'm keeping these leaves really loose, really simple. The size 4 round brush makes it easy. I'm kind of just dotting and swiping. The more pressure and the longer I leave my brush on the paper, the bigger the leaves are. I can make sure that I have more blobby areas so it looks like there's a lot of depth and more concentrated leaves in certain areas. And then I can make tinier, quicker dots as I get farther out to represent smaller, more straggly leaves as it comes out of the plant. So we want to have both, because if we have too many of the tiny dots, it's going to look very busy. So we need the combination of blobbier areas and then thinner, dottier areas as we come out. So it's really fun to create that shape and movement with the leaves. You don't have to be completely married to your reference photo, but using it as a guide is nice. Once again, I'm using cad yellow and ultramarine blue mixture for the base color of my leaves, adding more yellow in some areas, more water in some areas to get a variation. And then I can add more concentrated ultramarine blue into my green mixture, tap that in for more shadows. So there's going to be more shadows in the depth of the plant. So right as the leaves are coming out of the pot, I created a little bit more shadow. And then we want to determine, where is our light source coming from? Where are there going to be more shadows? So I have a few more shadows placed on the left of my pot and the left of the leaves, because that's where I want my shadows to be. I also, don't forget, drag some of that paint in very thin lines to create the very thin branches of this greenery. Picking up more of our cad red, I do like to add a tiny bit of magenta into my red to make it very punchy. I can add a few details to my red flowers on the left side that I've already painted, and now we have some layers in our very tiny flowers, and it just looks so cool. It might be hard to see because it's kind of small, but it has so much depth. So again, we're using the tip of our brush to create these small red flowers, creating little bunches, kind of following our reference photo and filling in some of these gaps that we've left in our greenery for where we want our red flowers. We can use the red also to create more movement, more height coming up, and to fix maybe some weird spots. So here on the left, it felt a little bit too even as the flowers were coming cascading down. And so I can add more flowers in one of the sections so that it's a little bit longer and we have more of an uneven balance to those flowers. As everything is starting to dry, we can add more of this red color so we can continue to create that depth like we did on the flowers on the left. And don't be afraid to create flowers that are just a tiny dot, because some of these flowers are going to be tucked in, hard to see, maybe mixed in with the greenery, so we don't need to create full flowers every time we paint a flower. If you feel like once everything dries, the shadows are not punchy enough, there's not enough contrast, I like to go into my indigo, mix that into my greens so it's a really deep blue-green, and then use that very lightly in some of my shadowy spots. This darker final bit of contrast is always very intense, and so make sure it's just a little bit goes a long way, but it gives an overall nice effect of having light, medium, and dark values within the piece. Now I'm feeling really happy with how the plant portion looks, and we're going to move on to creating this terracotta pot. I don't have brown on my palette. One of my favorite brown mixtures though is cad yellow, cad red, and ultramarine blue in different variations. So if you want a warmer brown, add more cad yellow. You want a deeper red brown, add more cad red. Darker blue brown, add more ultramarine blue. So we're going to make sure that this initial color is very light, because remember, watercolor, we start with our lightest values and we can tap in some of our darker browns for shadow as everything is still wet. So we're going to try to layer and build up those colors so that it's a little bit more subtle. I'm not really married to the color of the pot in my reference photo, so I'm staying more on the brown side, but I added more ultramarine blue into my brown mixture to get a deeper blue shadow color while everything is still wet, because I've determined my light source is coming from the right side. I'm focusing a lot of that shadow color on the left and tucking it underneath those plants that we've already painted. Once I've placed that color, if it's not blending out enough or maybe it's too intense, I can rinse my brush and with a damp brush blend that color out more so that it is a gradient versus having a hard line. Now we're going to let the pot dry and we're going to work on the ground. What is this pot sitting on, and where is the shadow? So I want to create more of a brown color, added more ultramarine blue into my brown mixture with a little bit of cad yellow. I don't want it to be too dark because a lot of the deep brown color is coming from the pot. I don't want it to compete. So I added some more water, and I'm using a dry brush technique, catching my paper by side swiping my brush so I get this rough texture, almost to make it look like the ground is rough, kind of like the rocks in the picture. And then to that ground color, I'm adding more ultramarine blue into my mixture so that when I'm painting the ground on the left side of the pot where my shadow is, I'm actually creating this uneven shadow. And to get a more diffused look to my shadow, once I paint that color, I get some water on my brush and I can use the dry brush technique to blend it out a little bit more so that we have that rough texture of the rocks in the ground around it. Now that I have the ground figured out, I felt like the background fell a little bit flat without any color around the plants. And so using my same combo of brown, cad yellow, cad red, ultramarine blue, I'm mixing up a light warm brown for this background wall. I wanted it to feel warm, like maybe the sunlight was hitting it, and so I leaned more into the cad yellow, but added a lot more water to my mixture so that it was a very light wash. I'm very carefully going around the greenery and the flowers, tucking this color in, but also not making it too perfect. You can see I'm leaving some white space. I'm going rather quickly so that it doesn't feel outlined. It's tucked in, but there's still some breathing room. I also really like that I'm not bringing the paint to every single corner of the paper. We don't have to fill it in. I like the jagged, uneven imperfectness of the way this background is coming together, and I like that it is light and warm and really feels like it is continuing to ground the piece. Mixing together my red, some ultramarine blue, a little bit of magenta, some cad yellow, I'm getting a bluish brown color to add to the wall while it is still wet, because even though it's the back wall, it is not the main focus. It needs a little bit more dimension. That plain yellow color will make it feel flat, and we don't want it to be flat, we just want it to be present. Now that everything has dried, we're going to continue adding texture and shape and contrast to our pot. Again, I'm using my cad yellow, cad red, ultramarine blue. You could add a little bit of magenta, anything that gives you this deeper brown color, but we don't want to be too blue yet. I'm still leaning more heavily into my cad yellow and my cad red, outlining under the lip of that rim at the top of the pot is going to give you a nice shadow, and then we'll bring that color down on the left side, tucking it in and around the plants so that we can emphasize the shadow on the left side of the pot. We can even add some ultramarine blue into that shadow to emphasize the coolness. This middle section of the pot, right after the shadow but before the highlight, we can play with some dry brush technique to create textures that we see in the reference photo on this pot as well. Keep adding more ultramarine blue into your brown mixture and add that into your shadows as everything is starting to dry. You will get less blooming and closer to the hard lines. Some of your more medium values can be that in-between stage where it's blending just a little bit but the line is not too hard. And then you can go in with indigo into your brown mixture and really pump up the contrast and the shadows on that left side using more of the hard lines. And here you can see I'm dragging some of that shadow along the base of the pot, and that's because the pot and the ground are too similar in color, and so we can help differentiate between those two objects by bringing just a tiny bit of that shadow line across. Now, dipping into our lighter brown colors, we can start adding more texture, especially on the lighter side, because the lighter side of the pot, while bright, probably wouldn't be this light. So we can add some of these deeper textures. Just make sure the textures are not too dark too soon. We can build up our textures as well with lighter colors, darker colors, and so forth. Now, I thought that this right side of the wall and the pot were too similar in color, so it was hard to differentiate between the pot and the wall. And so here I'm adding more of a reddish brown to help define this right edge of the pot and make it look more highlighted. So we're trying to find ways to show contrast. If we want our bright highlighted areas to really stand out, they need a contrasting slightly darker color next to it. And we're going to continue to mix up more browns to add definition to our pot and the ground. Again, cad yellow, cad red, ultramarine blue, maybe even a little magenta. In different forms and variations will give you such a wide range of browns. You do not have to mix up your own browns, but I think it's nice to mix up your own browns because if you're using the same colors to mix up a variety of browns, your painting will feel very cohesive because they'll all be in the same color family. But feel free to use burnt umber, raw sienna, Van Dyke brown, all the browns, they're great. Here we are just helping to define more of the shadows underneath the pot. On the side of the pot, we're grabbing some more of our reddish brown to create textures. You can add more indigos and blues around the shadowy edges of the plants and the leaves, making sure that everything is casting a shadow. Even here on the highlighted side, there's a little bit of a cast shadow from these leaves. We're just in those final stages of a painting where we are kind of being nitpicky, making sure there are enough shadows in the plant, shadows on the pot, textures on the pot, shadows on the ground, textures on the ground, and that everything looks completed. This is a very easy stage to overwork your painting at, so try to sit back and look at your painting, even take a picture of your painting and see where you think maybe there needs to be something different. or even sleep on it and come back later, because sometimes that helps too. A few more scrubby details on this painting and it is finished, or at least I'm happy with it now. I'm sure I can always go back and add some more details like I do. But now we're going to take the tape off. The tape peel at the end is the best part, and I always feel like it makes the painting look better somehow with all of the tape removed, and we can see those crisp edges from the background that we painted so long ago. Now, when I paint these on Patreon, we always date it, number it, and sign it. So in the 100 painting series, we have different numbers within the 100 that we sign onto our paintings. But today we're going to write bonus out of 100, 2025, and then we'll sign our name. Thank you so much for painting this beautiful bonus tiny painting with me today. If you want more information about tiny paintings, please check out my Patreon linked below. All 50 tutorials are up on Patreon and available now, and I cannot wait to paint the next 50 with you. I will see you all in my next video. Bye, guys.